In the early hours of February 21, 1965, the sound of gunfire shattered a crowded ballroom in Harlem. Within moments, Malcolm X lay mortally wounded, and America lost one of its most uncompromising and evolving voices on race, power, and democracy. His death froze him in public memory as a symbol of rage and confrontation. But that image tells only a fraction of the story. To understand Malcolm X is to trace a life shaped by terror and resilience, anger and discipline, certainty and doubt. It is to confront uncomfortable truths about American history and to reckon with a man who refused to accept the limits placed on him by society, even as he continuously revised his own beliefs. Malcolm Little was born on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska, into a nation rigidly divided by race. His parents, Earl and Louise Little, were active supporters of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, a movement that emphasized black self-reliance, pride, and independence at a time when white supremacy was enforced through law and violence. Louise Little struggled to keep her family together under the weight of grief and economic hardship. Over time, the pressure proved overwhelming. When Malcolm was 13, his mother was committed to a state mental hospital where she would remain for decades. The children were scattered among foster homes and institutions. For Malcolm, this fragmentation reinforced a sense of abandonment by a society that claimed to value justice while repeatedly denying it to people who looked like him. Despite these hardships, Malcolm was a bright student. Teachers recognized his intelligence, but even praise came with limits. When he expressed interest in becoming a lawyer, a teacher told him that such ambitions were unrealistic for a black student and suggested a trade instead. The message was clear: talent did not override race. This moment crystallized Malcolm's growing awareness that the American promise of equal opportunity was selectively applied. As a teenager, Malcolm drifted toward the margins. He moved to Boston and later to New York City, immersing himself in the underground economy of hustling, gambling, and petty crime. The city offered excitement and autonomy, but it also carried dangers. In 1946, Malcolm was arrested for burglary and sentenced to prison. He was 20 years old, angry and directionless. Prison, however, became the setting for one of the most dramatic transformations of his life. Behind bars, Malcolm encountered members of the Nation of Islam, a religious movement that combined elements of Islam with black nationalist ideas. The Nation taught that African Americans were the original people of the world and that white society had been built on exploitation and deception. For Malcolm, these teachings offered an explanation for his lived experience of injustice. They reframed his anger as clarity and his suffering as evidence of systemic wrongdoing. Malcolm immersed himself in study. He read voraciously, copying entire dictionaries by hand to expand his vocabulary. He devoured history, philosophy, and religion, sharpening his intellect and honing his ability to argue with precision and force. When he was released from prison in 1952, he no longer identified as Malcolm Little. He had become Malcolm X, the X symbolizing the African name lost through slavery and a rejection of what he saw as an imposed identity. Within the Nation of Islam, Malcolm rose rapidly. Under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad, he became one of the movement's most visible and compelling ministers. His speeches were electrifying, delivered with disciplined intensity and razor-sharp logic. He criticized American racism not as a moral failure alone, but as a structural reality embedded in law, economics, and culture. He rejected the idea that integration alone could solve these problems and argued instead for black self-determination, economic independence, and self-defense against violence. At a time when the mainstream civil rights movement emphasized nonviolence and integration, Malcolm's message was deliberately confrontational. He challenged what he saw as the hypocrisy of a nation that preached freedom abroad while denying it at home. He rejected appeals to patience, arguing that African Americans had waited long enough. While he did not advocate indiscriminate violence, he insisted on the right of black communities to defend themselves, a position that drew intense criticism and media scrutiny. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Malcolm X had become one of the most recognizable black figures in America. Television appearances and newspaper profiles amplified his influence, but they also simplified his image. He was often portrayed as the angry counterpart to Martin Luther King Jr., a binary that obscured the complexity of both men's views. Malcolm himself resisted easy categorization. He was a disciplined organizer, a devoted husband and father, and a relentless student of history who constantly refined his arguments. Yet beneath his public Success, tensions were growing, as Malcolm learned more about Elijah Muhammad's personal conduct, including allegations that conflicted with the moral code the nation preached. His faith in the organization's leadership was shaken. At the same time, his public prominence began to overshadow that of the movement's founder, creating internal resentment. The breaking point came in 1963, after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. When asked to comment, Malcolm described the killing as a case of violence returning to a violent society. Although his remarks were consistent with his long-standing critique of American violence, they were widely condemned as insensitive. The Nation of Islam suspended him from public speaking, a move that formalized a rift that had been widening for months. In 1964, Malcolm X officially left the Nation of Islam. The departure marked the beginning of the most dynamic and misunderstood phase of his life. Freed from organizational constraints, he began to reassess many of his earlier positions. He founded new groups focused on political education and international solidarity, signaling a shift from religious separatism toward a broader human rights framework. That same year, Malcolm undertook a pilgrimage to Mecca. The journey proved transformative. There he encountered Muslims of every race and nationality praying together as equals. This experience challenged his previous belief that racial divisions were immutable. He returned to the United States with a more expansive worldview, recognizing that while racism was deeply entrenched in American society, it was not inherent to human nature. Malcolm's evolving perspective did not mean abandoning his critique of American racism. Instead, it sharpened it. He began to frame the struggle of African Americans as part of a global fight against colonialism and oppression. He sought to bring the United States before international bodies, arguing that civil rights violations were not merely domestic issues, but matters of human rights deserving global scrutiny. This evolution made Malcolm both more dangerous to his enemies and more isolated. He received constant threats, and his home was firebombed shortly before his death. On February 21, 1965, while preparing to speak to supporters, he was assassinated. He was 39 years old. Malcolm X's life cannot be reduced to a single slogan or stage. He was not static. He was a man in motion, willing to confront his own errors and revise his beliefs in light of new evidence and experience. That willingness to grow is central to his legacy. In the decades since his death, Malcolm X has been alternately vilified, romanticized, and selectively quoted. Yet the full measure of his contribution lies in his insistence that America live up to its professed ideals, or at least be honest about its failures. He forced uncomfortable conversations about power, history, and accountability, conversations that remain unresolved. Today, as debates over racial justice, policing, economic inequality, and national identity continue, Malcolm X's life offers a sobering reminder that progress is neither linear nor guaranteed. His journey from trauma to militancy, from certainty to reflection, underscores the importance of critical thinking and moral courage. Understanding Malcolm X is not about choosing sides in history's arguments. It is about recognizing the cost of injustice, the power of transformation, and the enduring need to confront truth even when it disrupts comfort. Malcolm X also left behind a body of ideas that continue to challenge how America understands dissent and patriotism. He argued that love for justice sometimes requires opposition to the state, especially when the state perpetuates harm. In this sense, he redefined what it meant to be politically engaged, urging people to study history, question authority, and recognize how narratives are shaped by those in power. His speeches were not just calls to action. They were lessons in critical awareness, designed to strip away comforting myths and replace them with hard analysis. One of Malcolm's most enduring contributions was his emphasis on psychological liberation. He understood that centuries of enslavement and segregation had not only limited Black Americans materially, but had also distorted self-perception. He spoke often about internalized inferiority and the need to reclaim dignity, culture, and historical memory. This focus on mental freedom influenced later movements that emphasized Black pride, cultural affirmation, and self-definition, extending far beyond religious or political boundaries. Importantly, Malcolm X's later years demonstrate that ideological rigidity was never his final destination. His willingness to admit mistakes, to publicly revise long-held beliefs, and to embrace complexity stands in contrast to the way he is often remembered. This evolution is sometimes overlooked because it complicates simple narratives, yet it is precisely this openness to growth that makes his story so relevant. Malcolm showed that conviction does not require stagnation and that strength can coexist with humility. His relationship with other civil rights leaders has also been oversimplified. While Malcolm and Martin Luther King Jr. differed sharply in strategy and tone, they shared a common diagnosis of America's racial problem. Both recognized that inequality was structural, not accidental, and both understood that moral appeals alone were insufficient without sustained pressure. Near the end of his life, Malcolm expressed respect for King's work, acknowledging that multiple approaches could coexist within a broader struggle for justice. After his assassination, Malcolm X's ideas continued to circulate through his speeches, interviews, and autobiography, which became one of the most influential political memoirs of the 20th century. The book introduced new generations to his life story, not as propaganda, but as a raw account of transformation shaped by experience, study, and reflection. It offered readers a framework for understanding how personal history intersects with national history and how identity can be consciously reconstructed. Malcolm's impact can be traced through later movements that emphasized self-defense, community control, and international solidarity. His insistence on connecting domestic racial issues to global systems of exploitation anticipated later analyses of globalization and neocolonialism. Even outside activist circles, his critique of media, education, and political language resonates in an era of widespread misinformation and polarized debate. Yet Malcolm X remains unsettling precisely because he resists easy incorporation into a sanitized version of history. He does not fit neatly into narratives of inevitable progress or national redemption. He reminds us that democracy is not self-correcting and that rights are rarely granted without pressure. His life forces a confrontation with the reality that reform often emerges from conflict, not consensus. Remembering Malcolm X today is not about replicating his words or strategies, but about engaging with his method, rigorous self-education, fearless critique, and a refusal to accept injustice as normal. His story challenges individuals and societies to ask uncomfortable questions about who benefits from the status quo and who pays the price. In the end, Malcolm X exposed America not by attacking it from the outside, but by holding it accountable to its own declarations of freedom and equality. He revealed the distance between promise and practice, and he did so at great personal cost. That is why his history still matters, not because it offers simple answers, but because it demands honesty, courage, and an ongoing commitment to justice in a world that often prefers silence.